advice to young climbers who just keep being who you are as a climber, like make sure that's still your priority. And you could do the gigs with the sponsors, you could do the videos and the marketing campaigns and the silly this, silly that sometimes, but like that's the responsibility for sure. But try to keep your vision the way it was as genuine as it can be, because that'll create a longer lasting um, relationship with climbing for yourself, but also for the companies. If they see that you get responses like, yeah, so and so is a good person. I saw them at the crag. They stayed a bit longer. They supported their friend. They climbed really hard. It was super awesome. That whole package is what counts really. And that's
All right, Tim, my dude, John. We got Jon Cardwell on the podcast. How's it going, you
Jon
guys?
Cardwell, what's up?
how's it
How's
going?
it going? Thanks for
John,
coming on, John.
yeah,
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you guys.
dude, we're the excited. We're super psyched. We get to talk to you about all the cool things that you've been doing for your whole life. You're one of the best American sport climbers. Yeah, I mean, you've also bouldered a little bit, like you've climbed, a hard boulder or two, maybe the game. I think people might have heard of that.
I
Uh,
dabble.
yeah, I mean, it's all
Yeah.
climbing. But I got a question from Ethan Pringle, and I'm going to just say
Oh,
Ethan
cool.
speaks for all of us
Yeah.
when he wants to know, John, have you ever done a backflip on a BMX bike?
I have not,
Ah,
nor have I attempted. Yeah.
mm. Well, maybe
Yeah.
maybe Ethan was wrong. Did you used to do BMX when you were younger?
I oh yes, definitely. So I rode a lot for a number of years, and actually a few of my friends who we rode together, they moved on into the BMX world. Some were like sponsored athletes as riders in BMX, and a good friend of mine actually moved to Los Angeles, and he's a photographer. I'll have to look up exactly who he shoots for, but it was Ride BMX for a while and a couple other brands and stuff. He just does, he's in that world basically like Bearcam or something as to climbing. He does that for the BMX world. So it's kind of cool. So we still keep in touch every now and then because they've done a couple traveling trips to Barcelona because it's a big riding scene there also. And
Huh.
he would be there shooting, and I would be like in Sierra, like an hour away, like climbing. I don't.
Wow.
We never met up. It would have been really cool because he was like, I would love to shoot climbing someday as shooting like BMX. It's like a lot of flashes and big wide fisheye lenses and really creative photography style, like urban photography. But he's always wanted to just jump into a climbing crag one day and just see what he could do.
Isn't it interesting
So
how
that's a random.
yeah,
Yeah.
just hopefully Ethan sent us a bunch of really good questions, so he'll pop up
Oh, cool.
again. But isn't it interesting how it's like you had this crew, you guys were really good, and you went off and were really good at climbing. Like it's always interesting how you get people together who are psyched and they just excel at something. And I'm gonna say
hmm
BMX probably good for your head, your head game in climbing, but probably
hmm
not what I would maybe pick out as the best sport to do before climbing as far as preparing your upper body or your fingers. But how'd you transition out of that and into climbing?
Well, actually, so BMX was maybe like a peer thing. So like my friends in school, probably from maybe elementary, I want to say, probably middle school is when we really were like, oh, we ride bikes and we go build dirt jumps because we had a lot of open space in New Mexico, in Albuquerque at the time. So there was all these open lots where you could just like go build your dirt jumps and stuff. It was like really fun, like future housing developments basically. We were always like devastated when we would like leave for a week or something, come back and like the housing developers have like moved in and like cleared the land. And we're like, no, like
Dude, they
months of
probably
hard
show
work,
up. They probably show up and they're like, "What the
Yeah,
hell are
they
these
see all
kids
these
just?"
dugout jumps or whatnot. So I did that like as a pure thing probably, and I obviously really enjoyed it. Like we built like custom BMX bikes and stuff. I had all the little magazines. And So I did that probably through high school, but another huge part of my athletic life before climbing was skiing. And I have a pretty
Wow.
big background in skiing, and my family, my stepfather and my stepbrother, specifically, he was on the US ski team racing downhill for over 10 years. He went to the Olympics in Salt Lake City,
Wow.
and we got to see that. It was really cool. So I was just like, from a really young age, really inspired by skiing, and not only skiing, but at like an elite level. That was just like what I was exposed to. And my stepfather obviously was in skiing also, and he was a ski instructor in Taos, which is a pretty really nice ski area in northern New Mexico. And it's kind of like a little more extreme and difficult mountain. I think a lot of people would agree. So on the weekends we would go skiing, and that was just all I knew. And they kind of just, it was crazy. Like they saw that I learned how to ski, and he taught me for maybe a year or something like that. And then the next season he was like, well, I'm off to work, and I showed interest, so they would just let me loose on the mountain like all day. Like maybe $5 for like some food or something like that. It was crazy. They were just like, be back at 2:30 or 3, and this is like early teens. And now that I think back on it, I was like, that's crazy. Like, what if something happened, or I didn't really, there's no cell phone, or you know what I mean? Like, I didn't really have a way to contact them or anything like that. I just knew that I had to be at the ski lodge or at the base of the mountain by before the end of the day, and just kind of wait for them. Because so I just went nuts on the mountain for like a couple years, you know?
That is
That's
crazy that
Yeah.
how
nothing
cool
bad
is
ever
it?
happened.
How cool
No,
is
no,
it
I never got hurt skiing.
that you got to just when you were super young go to the Olympics and see someone you knew there? That really does, just from the
Hmm.
very beginning. You're like, oh, I'd like to do that thing. I'd like to be in the Olympics and be an elite athlete. So
Y-
that's a good way to
Yeah, it
start the
was.
path, man.
Yeah, and it probably subconsciously influenced me at a young age. Now that I think about it, I'm like, that's crazy. Like if I went to Olympics now for like a sibling, it would be like the most, like I would be like very proud and like super excited. I think we'll have to look back. When was Salt Lake? I think that was probably like 2002 or 3.
Wow.
I
But
think
then it was a long
it
time
might have
ago,
been
so I
before.
just barely started climbing, and it was very early on, I
Mm.
think,
I was
so
gonna ask.
didn't register too much with me at the time.
Yeah. So how old were you when you started climbing, and did you stop BMX or skiing for any specific reason other than that you started climbing and were putting your whole life into that?
Yeah,
Pretty damn
well,
good at
like,
that one.
well, as you guys know, like when I started climbing, I didn't put my whole life into it at first. It was kind of this really fun, just like kind of wild experience for me. I found a lot of freedom in climbing, and I could kind of like, it felt like I could do kind of or try whatever I wanted to. There wasn't as many rules as like traditional sports. So I really latched onto that. So you think like mountain biking, skiing, climbing, they're all kind of similar in the sense that you could kind of choose your own path. I mean, with skiing, you eventually go into competitions or something like that, so it's kind of regulated. Same with climbing, but you can just go to the mountain and ski and become a really good skier, and just kind of take your own path. So that being said, I started climbing when I was around 11. I think it was either 10 or 11. And my mom had some coworkers who their kids were on like a climbing summer camp or program or something like that. It might have even been the team, like a youth team. And so she was trying to find stuff to like occupy me because I had like a lot of energy. And of course, I was like riding bikes. And this might have even been a little bit before like I was really into bikes, to be honest, and even skiing. I think those kind of came early teens as well. They all kind of came on at the same time. And what I would say is that climbing just lasted. Like, with biking, as you know, I never got seriously hurt, but I'd wipe out sometimes on the jumps, and like my wrist would really hurt or my shoulder or something like that. And I would go into the gym and I was like, I can't climb the same. It hurts. And I'd take a week off. And that happened a couple times. And I was like, I can't, I don't want to. I would rather climb than get hurt on the bike, And thankfully for skiing, I never got hurt. So skiing never really seemed like it got in the way. But once, my stepfather, I think he stopped. He stopped he wasn't instructing in Taos anymore at a point of time, and so we just kind of stopped going as frequently, so it kind of just faded out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm glad you stuck with climbing.
Yeah, me too.
Definitely, you seem very
It
well
was
suited
it
to
was
it.
pretty clear,
Yeah.
yeah, early on. Yeah.
So you grew up in New Mexico,
Hmm.
and I said you were, and I will say again, you're one of the best American sport climbers. What is it about sport climbing? Like, I feel like Tim, I feel like one of our themes, like our sub themes, is that sport climbing's awesome and people don't do it that much anymore, especially in America.
Well,
Go
definitely an
ahead.
American
Definitely
culture, yeah.
American.
And it's
Definitely
almost
America.
like, yeah, there's
Yeah.
definitely
Oh
like a
yeah.
mystique behind sport climbing in that, like, I mean, first of all, I think there's a ton of misconceptions. So I would love to hear,
Hmm.
John,
Or
your
just, yeah,
thoughts on
like how'd
that
you
as
get
well.
drawn to it? Or like, why do you think
Hmm.
it's not as popular anymore? I mean, is it like this the
Yeah.
era? Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think like maybe well, honestly, when I was younger, I was really into bouldering. We had Waco tanks not too far away, and it was basically in my backyard. So a lot of my early climbing trips and I don't know, like projects and stuff were boulder prom projects and in Boulder. And early on, I became friends with Daniel Woods. We competed. We were in the same region together. So we met each other, and at that time, he was really already excelling. So he was like kind of instrumental in my early climbing. He helped push me, and just by osmosis, I was like, if he's doing that, I should be doing that kind of thing. So I just kind of started following that trend. And then he was friends with Paul Robinson. So then we ended up all kind of being friends and traveling together and stuff. And those guys, as you know, they really were kind of boulders, and especially when they were younger, kind of focused in on bouldering. So that's kind of all we did when we were younger. And it was Daniel who still kind of dabbled in sport climbing. And Daniel and myself, we competed in sport climbing as youth climbers. So I think I saw that I was naturally more talented at sport climbing, or that I just felt more comfortable sport climbing. And then I would go bouldering with Paul and Daniel, say to Waco, and they were breaking into V12s, V13s, V14s eventually at a young age. And I was still kind of a little behind, I was like doing V10s and V11s, and that was really good at the time. And I saw my progression, but I always saw that there was like a little bit of it was really hard to catch up to where those guys were pushing the bar. And eventually I got there in certain regards, but at a certain point I was like, I like this sport climbing thing. And a lot of the magazines that I got when I was younger, climbing magazines, or eventually like online stuff, I just found it more interesting, and I would like really soak it up, like the biography or dosage films and all that. I just love those parts of the films even more.
I gotta hand
Yeah.
it to
Way
you.
to way to lean into the.
Sorry,
Go
Yeah.
sorry,
ahead,
Tim.
Josh. I think we were
Oh
about to
yeah.
say the same thing.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I was actually gonna say, what interest? I wanted to give you credit for being around Daniel and Paul and being just like a little bit below when you were younger and not
Hmm.
like giving up or taking that, like to randomly stumble into Daniel Woods and be like, oh man, this guy who's maybe one of the strongest climbers who has ever lived physically, right? I mean, his fingers and
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Uh-huh.
just it's really good to have that osmosis, but sometimes that can strike people down where they go like, well, Daniel can do one arm pull ups on 6 mil when he's 12 years old, and I can't do
Hmm.
that, so I'm never going to be great. And there's a mind game there too, where it can be a little tricky when you're younger, especially you haven't. Everyone. Well, I mean, there's different times where you get stronger, puberty and who are we talking to? Actually, I won't name names. There's someone who is like 18 or 19, and we were talking about how you still get stronger after there. Sometimes some people really get
Hmm.
quote unquote, I'm going to say adult strength. I don't want to get canceled. Adult strength. Like I felt like my pinches got
Hmm.
stronger later.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. Cause when I think of the history of sport climbing and then when Daniel and Paul kind of were hitting the scene, I always compared, this is just really random analogy, but kind of obvious, is there was Dave Graham and Chris Sharma.
Hmm.
And, Dave was the kind of thinner, tall guy. And I equated that to Paul and, Sharma and Daniel,
Yeah.
and they were like the boulderers though, right? It's like, this is bouldering. Like, and now,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and now we've evolved to bouldering, but it's cool that you found your, it's like, okay, like this is fun, but then, you tapped into
Well,
what you really liked.
I mean, I will say that like while those guys they were really kind of like pushing the bar higher for youth climbing, I would say, especially in that era. I was still like second, so like for instance, like Daniel and I would compete, he would be first, I would be second, all the way up into nationals for like I don't know, a number of years in a row, or like I was third or second or something like that. And every now and then we would swap, but only in like the sport climbing competitions. And actually at that time there was no bouldering events for youth climbers until you were like 15, then you can enter like ABS nationals or something like that. So we didn't have bouldering events. But it was outside that it was apparent where it was more apparent that Paul, Daniel, even we were good friends with Vasya Vorodnikov. He lives
Mhm.
in Colorado now, but he was from New Hampshire, and they were all really, strong. But Vasya was like a good sport climber, and so he kind of convinced when we would get together, like Daniel, Vasa, and I, we would go to Rifle, and those are kind of the trips that Paul wouldn't come along with as much, at the time. And but we'd spend like the summer in Rifle, go sport climbing, and or we would go to Rumney or something like that. So sport climbing was always kind of there. And I think because that I was like close enough within reach that I was always motivated to just keep working harder. It never was at the point where I was like, I'll never catch up or I got discouraged. It was always a point of motivation when I would climb with Daniel. And then, they were good friends too. So they were like super encouraging at the same time. Like
Yeah,
you can do it or try this or, whatever,
I feel like I
So
told Dick, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say you were below those guys. It's just sometimes
no,
when you're super
I
young,
I
like,
was though. Yeah.
well, but yeah, you
You know,
definitely
they
came into your own.
yeah.
And so
They constantly pushed me is all I'm saying,
yeah,
and they probably only pushed me because they were kind of a step ahead, and I thrived off that. I really, um, if I had passed a lot of people when I was younger, maybe I wouldn't have been as ambitious as I was. You know what I mean? So I always had the bar. I was never satisfied, let's put it that way, as a youth climber. I always wanted kind of a little bit more, no matter, if I would reach a certain milestone. My good buddy Daniel was already climbing V14, so I was like, oh, I climbed V11, now it's time for V12. It was just a natural progression, and they really were important in that. I just had those role models, even though they're my total peers, they're definitely people I look up to.
Dude, that sentiment is like so much more rare than it should be. I think like
Mm.
I grew up very, very similar in climbing and comp climbing where, I started relatively late compared to the local crew. Like there was like the
Mhm.
Mirko Caballero who was already climbing like
Oh yeah,
V13,
Mirko.
at
Yeah.
13, and
Uh-huh.
Ross and Sam were
Hmm.
already sending double digit boulders, and I came in and I was like, but I want to be strong. I want to be just as good as them, and I never
Hmm.
was gonna be. Like I think I knew that right away. Like physically, I knew I was never gonna be. They were like bred for
well,
this
I
sport.
don't
They're
know,
Or
dude.
at least, or at,
physically
or
I
at
genetic.
the
agree, dude.
maybe at the age or
Well,
at the yeah.
but
Yeah,
but
maybe
like
at 12.
I don't
Yeah,
care about the result, right? Exactly. At that age, I
Yeah.
knew I was never going to be. So what that approach changed, right? So yeah, my point here is that you decide to go sport climbing, right? You decide,
Hmm.
well, but something comes more naturally to me. And I think like that
Hmm.
sentiment is extremely rare where kids, are like obviously kids are competitive and obviously kids like want to be better than the next guy and that I think when you grow mature and like perspective, you're like, well, but that osmosis that you're saying, that's what's really helpful. It's just observing. And I think
Hmm.
as kids, we have a little bit different emotion behind it. But objectively, that's probably the best way to grow is to be like, okay, well, what is this person doing that I am not doing? And what is the success and failure? What are the pros and cons? Because it's not to say that like every climber you ever watch is going to be just perfect, right? And in fact,
Yeah.
nobody is. So when you
No
watch, you
one
have
is.
to
Yeah.
also be good at observing what's good for me and what's not good for me. And I think
Hmm.
like that works out really well, more so than most kids put credit into, but then also deviating to what you actually are good at and what you actually enjoy and leaning that way. And then also
Hmm.
not being discouraged. I think, Josh's point, not being discouraged is, I think that's really, really also rare, because kids get like
Kids
competitive
get
and then
discouraged.
discouraged because they
Hmm.
feel kind of emotionally attacked by this person's better than me. I must not
Hmm.
be. I must not be right here. And it's like, it's not about that. It's like they're doing some things better, and they understand some things right at that time. And like, that's to me the coolest part about climbing. So it's cool to hear your whole upcoming with it, and involved with some of the greatest of all times. And then it's the same sentiment that I think a lot of kids can have, but you had to have that objective layer, that objective
Hmm.
lens, to be able to be like, well, but this is just good, this is bad, I'm going to go this way. And I think
Right.
that's the rare part. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there definitely was times where I was discouraged a bit, because no matter how hard I worked, and
You
then we
too?
would meet
Yeah.
up in Waco for oh yeah, like yeah, like it wasn't all just like, oh, just work harder, but
Right.
there were those points I would work harder. Like we'd go to Rocky Mountain National Park in the summer, we'd all meet up, everyone would do their thing. Most of us, all of us probably walked away from those trips like super motivated. Oh yeah, like next big trip will probably be Waco for winter break or something like that. And then there would be a point where like work so hard and then go to Waco and meet up with Daniel and them. And you have Daniel, who climbs Crown of Aragon in 5 minutes. And I'm like, I can't actually do the crux move of this or whatever at the time. It's just so crazy. Like how, like Daniel, his lineage of progression was incredible. Like one season we went to Waco. I think it was like 2003, and it was one of our first. It probably was our first trip together. And his first time in Waco, we went to Jablanc, I remember, and maybe we did choir boys or something like that. And Daniel like couldn't really do the moves on Jablanc, and then the next day he did it easily, and then was like, I'll come back in a couple months, and be stronger. And I think he came back in a couple months and climbed Esperanza. Like the jump was like
Wow.
substantial, like
Wow.
insanely. It wasn't like he came back next month and did, right Martini or something. He just went all the way to the top. And at the time, that was probably the hardest boulder problem in Waco, if not one of the hardest boulder problems in the country. So it was just like that. Like he did Echele, I think, and then went and did Esperanza. And maybe it was the season before when he worked on Chablanc,
Well, what's
So
interesting
the
is I wonder he said that he hasn't really gotten that much stronger, since then. Like I wonder if he really hit his
hmm
strength peak because you kind of there is a bit of a ceiling where it's like okay, you can go train a ton more and you get 0.5% stronger, And I just wonder if he hit his
yeah.
physical strength and he's gotten to be a better climber. But uh,
hmm
on this idea of Daniel, it sounded like he was the one who was still kind of pushing sport climber. He was interested in sport climbing, but what I find
He
really,
definitely was. Yeah.
yeah, which is cool that he does it all. But what's interesting is when I think
hmm
about we've talked a little bit about this in our like pre-interview. You and Daniel actually are somewhat similarly shaped. Like you guys are
hmm
I don't know very muscular. So similar heights, probably somewhat similar wingspan. Uh, but when I think of Daniel climbing, and maybe this is why he excels in bouldering, he almost seems to. I don't want to say this is bad technique, but I'm going to just use the word overpower things. Like I kind of think of him as being this
hmm
ball of tension. And how did you see that translate into his sport climb or not translate? And how do you think about your style of climbing compared to his, where clearly you guys climbed on boulders side by side, but you really excel in the
hmm
sport climbing arena.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually kind of cool because recently I've been learning a lot about physiology, just different ways that athletes exhibit their strength or utilize their strength. And what I think Daniel is like a classic example of someone with like an extremely high volume of like anaerobic power. Like, so he can pull on a crimp as hard as he can for longer than most of us can. It doesn't necessarily mean that he can crimp harder than us, but he can just do it more for longer. He's so strong, like, and he's been able to be strong like that for over a decade. You know what I mean? So I don't think he's actually even gotten that much stronger. He's just building on that anaerobic base, basically. And so when he goes sport climbing, it takes him a little bit of time to adapt and maybe get a little bit of aerobic, endurance and stuff. But he's just so much stronger that the moves simply he's able to sustain harder moves for longer, and that's what creates a really good sport climber in Daniel. But he might have this like period of time where he just like pumps out in total elbows to the wall, like really pumped. But then the next week you'll see him completely different, all of a sudden, like instantly a sport climber. It's because he has this solid base of pure power. And I think the difference between him and me is that I had a pretty solid anaerobic base, but I was probably more aerobically gifted. Like, so I was able to like do the marathon type routes when I was really young and just hang on forever and just be on the wall longer than, let's say, like it probably switches into aerobic, like your muscles and the way you release um, like energy is like changes after a couple minutes. So like past a boulder problem, right? And then all of a sudden you're an endurance athlete in a way. So
Yeah,
if you're on the
that
wall for half an hour, that's an endurance performance. But under 5 minutes or under three or two
right.
minutes even, that's anaerobic maximum power. And that's what Daniel's extremely good at.
I was talking to Josh about Cam Hurst, who has a coaching website, who
Hmm.
blogs on his coaching website about his sends, and he talked
Hmm.
about that. He talked
That
about the
exact
difference with
thing.
that
Yeah.
exact thing, and
Yeah.
he explained it a little bit differently than you, but it's the same exact idea where some things are spent first and then some things come later. So how you train is like very specific, and I think that thing you're talking about people having an extremely large anaerobic base, and that's what they base their hard climbing off of, or their output off of.
Hmm.
I think it's a lot of American climbers are like that, which is,
Yes. Yeah.
to kind of go back to Josh's question earlier about like, I think, why American sport climbing maybe, like, I think it's just the approach in training. I think it's just the approach
Hmm.
and the sheer volume, the sheer capacity of athletes that
I mean,
exist.
so it's funny, like speaking of like our volume of high-end sport climbers versus Europe or something like
Mhm.
that, you know how it's like relatively low probably, but I think we're sitting on a gold mine of like hundreds of extremely good American sport climbers, but they all just choose to boulder right now.
Mm.
But the
Dude,
moment
yeah,
they decide to get their act together and do a little bit of endurance training and
right.
apply this probably massive anaerobic base that most of these boulders have, they're gonna all climb 515s or you know what I mean, not 515s, but they're all gonna like extremely excel at
Agreed.
endurance climbing.
Yeah, and I thought you were
They
gonna
just
say
choose
too,
not to do it.
like there's a million American boulders. Like I
Yeah,
see kids
yeah.
every day who can
Hmm.
send like harder than I've ever seen send, and maybe performance is a different mindset here, which is something that we talk about a lot. But in
Hmm.
terms of sheer ability and sheer potential, American boulders are absolutely ridiculous. Like the kids nowadays are crazy.
Yeah, like just moving back to New Mexico and Albuquerque, a couple of the guys that work at the gym, a couple of the kids, they're like between 19 and 21 or 22. One of them just climbed their first V14 this year. He's so strong, like he's incredibly strong, and but they're completely like deer in the headlights, like like intimidated from like 14A. And like 14A is so far below your anaerobic base, like it's crazy. But they just don't know how to operate necessarily, and the number
Exactly.
itself and like all these external factors kind of prevent them from like pursuing. And like 14B is like the ceiling of the earth for them. They don't even like, they're like, I will never go past that. I'm like, you could easily climb 14D if you just had one to go try and weren't
The
as intimidated by it,
the only thing
you know?
about that's interesting though is sometimes you get these people who are freakishly strong and their
Hmm.
technique is good. I mean, you can't say when someone climbs V14 that their technique isn't good, but it's not
Right.
good in
Yeah.
this way where it's like they're so powerful, they waste so much energy in the
Hmm.
way they climb. And translating that over to climbing, I mean, I know someone who has climbed V13 and I'm not sure they can climb 511. Like if you took them to a
Yeah,
crag,
maybe.
I'm not joking.
Yeah.
I'm like, if you took them to a
Uh-huh.
crag and were just like, hey, like let's go on site a bunch of 511s, um,
Hmm.
they might be able on site like a 3 bolt 512 or something, but putting them on, really understanding how to twist and everything, that's it's just bouldering really is different. And I always
Hmm.
tell people who start climbing, that they should do more sport climbing because of the sheer volume of movement you get and just drilling that kind of efficiency. Because I think it does come through in hard bouldering too, because typically the most efficient way to do a move is actually the best way. It's not just efficient, it's actually the easiest way, even if you were at your max limit, which is hard for people to
Totally.
get
Yeah.
sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to understand. And I feel like that, yeah, that's like, it's so hard to understand because if you understood it as inefficiency, you would see it as like, you're sprinting a long run, right? It's like,
Hmm.
why are you sprinting a long run? Because it's in
Yeah.
climbing, it's not that simple. But that's what I see when I see people like strong boulders try to do a long route. I'm like, you're sprinting this run. Like, what are you doing? Like, why
That's
are
how
you
I
going
climb,
all
Tim.
crazy?
That's totally how
Well,
I
I mean,
climb.
if it's so it's kind of crazy to think of, like, if you compare climbing to other sports, if you look at like the marathon record, basically it's a long race, so it's a totally an endurance based
Right.
race, right? So the under 2 hours are reaching 2 hours, but the people running at that pace are running at sprint, so their maximum power output is close to a sprint. It's crazy how fast those runners run,
Right.
like the amount
And you
of
could say the
power
same thing about
needed.
sport climbing.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
and but
I,
to go back to the original or what you can,
Oh,
yeah.
I just wanted to,
So,
because you brought up Daniel and like anaerobic threshold.
hmm.
I just, there's something really interesting about what you said. This idea that he has a really large anaerobic threshold, and there's kind of two ideas there. There's
Hmm.
absolute power output, right? Like how much power can you do in 1 second, and then this idea of how can you sustain
Right.
your near maximal anaerobic threshold, which I think is actually only like 40 seconds or a minute. And the idea that maybe
Hmm.
he has like instead of it being 35 seconds where he can sustain nearly 100% power, it's like 52 seconds. And when you
Hmm.
said that, it really made me think of how Daniel often climbs boulders, where it's like, whenever I watch him climb boulders, it's like he overemphasizes getting into a position. Like he locks it off for longer to really find that next hold. And it's almost like you're like, dude, you are climbing like a sloth sport climber, except for you're on V15. And it's really
Hmm.
interesting hearing you say that, because it kind of was like, oh, like maybe he's almost like a slow boulderer because he has a lot of power
Because he has
reserves.
so much power.
Yeah, that's really
Yeah.
interesting. That's just kind of
Hmm.
an interesting idea.
I
Sorry,
would
I
love the lattice guys or someone to
Mm.
do those tests on him, because I think he would match up really close to the test that they did on like Will Bosey and Stefano. Of course, Daniel, we're
Mhm.
talking about one of the best boulders ever, so there's no doubt that his max power is there. But I would think that his actual, like, the threshold, his endurance is better than most people would think, just
in that
because
anaerobic
the
world,
way he
right? Yeah.
climbs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so
And like how
interesting.
you're explaining, he really does like stay in positions probably longer than a climber, like, I don't know, like Dave maybe, like Daniel stays in harder positions and Dave gets out of them really quick. He's a really smart climber and he climbs completely different, but their outputs are probably very different.
Well, and I watched you climb a bunch on video before we did this chat, and watching you on
Hmm.
like La Rambla. Like I don't think of you as being a super dynamic climber where you're all about jumping and cutting, but when you were on, on sport climbs, you're really like moving through. You're
Hmm.
not super locking off every move. And it's just
Yeah.
interesting seeing that style come through better in sport climbing. And I wonder if that's why you gravitated towards it, because just when you tap into how you want to move. Because I don't think that Daniel was like, oh, you know what, I'm going to choose to do it this style. It's just like that's how it came out of him, and that's who he is.
Yeah.
And I love that
Yeah.
when you express yourself on these amazing climbs, like that's how you show up, is just this smooth, flowy, like consistent, and it looks way different. It looks way different.
Yeah, I've been told that a lot, and I've thought about this a lot before this conversation, and yeah, I think what's really brought me into sport climbing is I find that it's quite a bit more cerebral. Like it's very challenging um for your mind. Like you're thinking a lot when you're sport climbing, and not that you're not thinking when you're bouldering, but bouldering is almost like a rehearsed thing. So you work a couple moves, and usually when you're doing those max limit moves, you're not thinking too much. doing them, you know, whereas sport climbing, especially like on-site sport climbing, you have to think really critical thinking is like maximum. And it would be cool if we could someday like do a study of like how how your brain is firing when you're doing like a really hard sport climb versus a short boulder prom that you've practiced. Say you practice a boulder prom for 3 days and they're like, all right, we're going to run the test now. And you get 10 minutes to try the boulder prom. And then the same with a sport climb. And then you get 20 minutes to red point the sport climb. How I would be interested how much brain activity is
Totally.
going on for
Also, like
each. And
on-site
of
versus
course,
red point, that would be cool. Like, what's your
oh
brain look
yes.
like on on-site? Because it's,
Totally.
Yeah.
boy, is it different. Yeah, yeah. I'd like to say
Yeah,
that I'm
and
doing good
on-site
critical
is
thinking,
is
but I don't know if I am.
I mean, on-site's probably my favorite type of climbing, I would say. And I've done a lot of it, and I haven't really excelled like beyond 14A, but I've climbed a lot of 514 on-site. And it's really kind of the moments where I felt like the most capable and the most like alive in my climbing. Mostly because I feel like I'm physically tired, but I'm like I come down from a hard onset and I feel very satisfied and kind of exhausted from it because my critical thinking and my the how much I processed what was going on was just like at another level than a hard red point. And almost a hard red point, I kind of shut off and try to like to go
Right.
on autopilot a bit. We can say autopilot or in the zone or whatever, but with on-site, you can't really go too much into autopilot because you really have to think about what's happening next,
Totally.
move for move,
That
you know?
I think that's I coaching youth climbers in competitions, whether it's bouldering or sport climbing, actually has become really interesting because of that. I've noticed that the ability to on-site for younger climbers nowadays is kind of very, very far from their ability to perform hard movements, hard committing
Hmm.
movements on like volume slabs, paddle dynos, coordination movements, just straight up hard movements. But then there's always, I think competition setting is also getting a lot better in that you can have an extremely simple climb, a short climb, and have it be really involved and like require critical thinking to do well. And
Hmm.
having, and I think you like on-siting because you're really good at this, but a lot of kids really hate on-siting, like are really, really bad at it
Yeah.
because their opinions, I think, to on-site well and to have good critical thinking, you need to make decisions off of your opinions, right? You constantly have response from the climb. The climb says, all right, these are your holds. This is what's the best way to do it. That's based off an opinion. It's not necessarily based off of like pure logic. You're not like calculating it. You're like, well, based on all of the moves I've ever done, I think this is the best way to do it. And your base opinion is probably pretty accurate to the potential, the actual, right? And a lot
Hmm.
of kids' base opinions are pretty damn far from like what they're actually capable of. And it's kind of about like meshing those two things together, right? And I think that's been like really interesting for me to coach for climbers because yeah, most people have like really negative language when it comes to like, well, I just don't think I can do that, or like I probably can't do that, and like people lean towards that. Whereas for you, I think the objective focus is probably a lot more like, how do I do that, right? Like based on what I
Yeah.
have, how do I
Hmm.
do that, right? And then you operate on it, and it's painful, it's hard, it's it's pumpy, like, but you
Well,
still operate on it.
it was often the case when I was younger, like, you know, there would be an on-site round for final. I would kind of prefer to be by myself observing the
Right.
route.
Same here.
And I
Yeah.
wanted that pure on-site because I felt like I performed better. And so, you know, a lot of kids are relieved when it's like a flash format. They're like, oh, that's great. And I'm kind of
I
like,
hate
yeah,
I
I
hate
wish
flash
I
format.
don't want to watch anyone climb the route.
Yeah.
I want to just go uninhibited in a way and just work with my intuition and the way that I
Right.
think. But as you sound pretty similar. Um, we're probably, you know, the minority in that group. You know, probably
Yeah.
most
Yeah.
people would prefer to watch others climb first.
Right.
Yeah,
Um,
can I ask you? Actually, I mean, I could ask both of you guys. John, you talked about some of the mental side or the critical thinking in sport climbing versus
mhm.
bouldering. So I'm better at bouldering than I am at sport climbing, but I think I like it more. But where I struggle with sport climbing, and what I'd be curious to hear from you is I have a lot of self-talk where I feel like there's this emotional battle. Both even at the like start, I'm like, oh, I'm tying in. I'm about to go like battle for like 20 minutes, Jesus.
Yeah.
And then I get to rest, and I'm like looking up. I'm like, but I'm tired right now, you know.
Mhm.
And then there's all these moves. Like every time I do a move and I get really pumped, I'm like, I mean, Josh, you're like really pumped. Maybe like you're just like you can't do this next move. You're tired now. And I mean, look, I'm an experienced sport climber. It's not like I haven't done it. I'm just being honest about, I it's
Hmm.
like a battle for me where I would argue that I still win that battle. I'm like, no, just focus on the technique. You know where to put your foot there. Okay, now do the next one. But do you get that self-talk? Like, let's say you're on an on-site or a hard red point and you're out or like a rest, you have that like running monologue that you have to battle, or is that just shows you what an amateur I am?
Well, I don't think that's amateur. I actually think that's a very common, that's like for most climbers, actually, even like anyone at any level in a sport. And it could simply mean that, like, if we compare it to running, you're a sprinter and that's what your body's designed for, what you prepared for mentally and emotionally, or physically and mentally, right? So you are a sprinter, whereas some athletes are, they run mid distance or long distance, and that's what they do, and sure, you can cross train, and some of the long distance or endurance climbers, let's bring it back to climbing, but the endurance climbers need a boulder in order to have more endurance. But vice versa, some of the boulders for max power, they need some endurance in order to sustain a competition round or to work on a project more than 20 minutes. Otherwise, they'd never get projects done because they're just blown out after 20 minutes. But that inner monologue, I mean, that's a difficult thing to block. It definitely happens to me occasionally, usually when there's a little more pressure and it means more to me, but on a day-to-day basis, that really doesn't happen too much. It's mostly when there's more at stake, like, oh, I really want to do the route this time, or I only have 5 days left in the trip, so each attempt really, really matters. Now, I think the best way to kind of address that is just to focus on the climbing, like the actual physiology of the climbing. So like if you're like, I don't know, I'm tired today, just say like, well, maybe I'm at 60% today. So I'm going to give 100% of my 60% now, and however far up the route I can get. I just kind of think in numbers like that, or analytically a bit, of how I'm feeling rather than putting negative self-talk in. I'll say like,
Dude,
okay,
I
if I'm
love.
more, yeah, you like that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I love that answer.
Yeah,
First of all,
yeah.
I love that you said that almost is no. Often there is no inner monologue for you, and I'm going to give my opinion on I think why that happens. But I'm
Mhm.
going to answer this. But then also you're saying that when it does happen, you just focus on the physiology of the climbing, which is exactly what you
Mhm.
should focus on. And Josh actually that it almost reminded me exactly of one time, actually a couple of times. Josh is like a mentor of mine, father figure of mine as well. He's older than me, and we obviously work together and have fun
Right.
doing it, and we're great friends. But I have come to Josh, for advice, and I've
Mhm.
asked him like, this is super hard. Like, does it get easier? Like, life is hard. Sometimes I'm like really busy,
Yeah.
just jam packed with stuff,
Oh
like
yeah.
super stressed out. Like, sometimes just get really frustrated. And I'm like, how do you deal with that? He's like, you know what, Tim? It never gets easier. You get
Mhm.
better. And I doubt Josh thinks that as often as I do about like how hard my day is or like how frustrating it is or whatever. He's usually focused on getting the day done because he has to. And I think that's exactly climbing. That's exactly sport climbing where like,
Mhm.
and for me, actually something that that came to mind was I also have a similar sentiment to John where like if I'm not sport climbing though, that inner monologue comes more often. And I took that approach to highballing. So when I went
Oh
highballing,
yeah.
I would never, ever, ever, ever go for a big highball if I didn't have a significant amount of volume. And for me, that significant number changes from trip to trip, but
Mhm.
a significant amount of experience or volume on highballs, period. On I take pads off of easy boulders just to
Mhm.
throw in the extra psychological
Mm,
factor. I
sure. Yeah.
do countless easy laps. I purposefully stay on down climbs for a really really long time, just to like feel where I am and have that awareness. Not again, not so that I like get better at having a response with my inner monologue, but just so that inner monologue doesn't come, right? Because
Mhm.
I think when you're aware of it and you realize, okay, this doesn't actually have an effect on my decision making, then you just kind of like let it be there. And I think that's really the rational thinking there. It's like it doesn't have an effect. Like it doesn't have a positive effect at all on
No.
what I'm trying to do. And
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do is nowhere even near what my inner monologue generally takes me. My inner monologue gives me my frustrations, my worries, my
Sure.
emotional response. So again, going back to your answer, I really like that. You said I don't think I usually have an inner monologue. I'm like, because you probably sport climb a ton, like a
Hmm.
ton, where you're often faced with that, and you're like, what doesn't? It's not going to get me to
Hmm.
stick the next move. It's not going to get me to commit to this foothold. It's not going to get me
Yeah.
to be efficient, you
I
know.
mean,
So
yeah, like, and like we were saying before, I mean, the inner monologue does enter my mind, but then if it does, I rationalize it with X, Y, and Z,
exactly, yeah,
Yeah. So if it's third day on, then I say it's third day on. You probably have 70% max output today. So why not capitalize with the 70% that you have? Don't expect
yeah,
100 necessarily. It's like basic finance, probably. It's like if you have X amount of money, instead of worrying about having way more money, maybe
mm,
see what you can do with the money that you have, right? And then, your output will be better. You'll have more
yeah,
results out of that way
100%.
of thinking, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's really cool to hear, and it makes me. I don't know if it makes me feel better that sometimes you both have the inner monologue, but it does make me feel. I guess it's reassuring to me to hear that my approach of focusing on the climbing and something that I heard from you, John, is just this positive attitude, really. And this is something that Tim is always saying: is have a positive attitude, like. I don't know if you show up and you just don't feel good that day. I hate those people who say, "Oh, conditions are bad." Like, "Oh, it's greasy a day. I'm
Mhm.
not going to send." And you're just like, "Well, yeah, you're definitely not with that attitude. Why give up before you're
Yeah.
even there? You don't know what you're
Well,
capable of." So
I mean,
I like that.
sometimes I say like, like if it's kind of humid or rainy or like the wind doesn't come that day or it's a little hotter, I always like kind of make a joke, like say I'm trying like an 8C plus or 14C, and I'm like, well, it's probably gonna feel like 14D today. So today I'm trying 14D and
Yeah,
not the
matching your
14C.
expectations.
It's a good thing
Yeah,
you
like I'm
can easily climb 14D. So
well, it's not even that it's easy. It's just I know that it's gonna feel harder than what
Yeah,
is it did
Mhm.
maybe the other
Yeah,
day,
yeah.
and that's a
yeah.
easier way to analyze conditions, I guess, or something like that, or fatigue
Ah,
or whatever.
these are
I mean,
so
it's kind of
cool.
playing little tricks on you
It's literally
yourself,
what I was going to say is you just I love
Hmm.
hearing these kind of little it's almost like a little game you play and I said I
Hmm.
really I am more of a boulder I'd say I am more of a sprinter to be honest, but I love the sport climbing because I actually love the battle that I have with my emotions and mental. I actually think it's really fun and really interesting. It's become really rewarding. And so on this note of on-sighting, flashing, or you guys don't love flashing, reminded me
Hmm.
of,
Not as much, yeah.
well, it reminded me of another question from our good friend Ethan Pringle, who,
Oh, great.
uh, so it looks like,
Mutual friend, I guess,
he,
between all of us.
yeah,
Ethan and I go back quite a long time,
he gets
actually.
around, man.
Yeah.
That
Uh-huh.
guy,
Yeah.
everywhere. He's been doing it for a while.
Did he, well, let's go to his question, but did he tell you like our first trip in France in
Oh,
2006 or 7
um,
and we road tripped and we're hitchhiking. It's when he did biography
oh,
and we were just like dirtbagging to the max, kind of.
no, but please go on. Maybe that would explain one of his other questions around shaved heads
Okay, well, we
and
could
who looks
start with his
better.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay. It looks like this is actually takes us to France as well. I don't even know how to
Mhm.
pronounce this crag's name, but is it Saint Leger? Is that
Yes, Saint Leger.
Saint Leger? Looks like
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
have climbed there a bit in the not too recent past, and Ethan
Hmm.
was just kind of wondering about your opinions on Super Krakenet and really like
Hmm.
what you thought of the climb and Andra flashing it, and is it really
Yeah.
super hard? And it looks like you put some effort into that climb too, and yeah, just insight into that process.
I put a yeah, okay. That's a great question because it's the most fresh for me. So I put a lot of effort into Super Krakenet this spring. I think I tried it about 30 days or 25 days. So a significant amount of time for me, even that's just like a lot of days. And the most interesting thing that I learned about Super Krakenet is the style of climbing. This is basically the catalyst of what threw me down the rabbit hole of learning more about climbers' physiology because I was really curious as to why I didn't climb the route. And because it on paper and the style of moves and all that, it kind of looked like something that I could go and climb relatively easily. But then upon reflection, I realized that 99% of the routes, or the majority of the routes that I've climbed at or near that level, are 3 times as long and triple the amount of moves. And this didn't really register to me at the time. But to talk about Krakenet itself is, yes, it's really hard. It's basically 30 moves of V8 to V9 climbing. And there's no one specific move that's much harder, and there's no one specific move that's much easier. It's basically a sprint. But relatively speaking, the moves aren't very challenging. It's just every single move has a little bit to it. And there's no just shake out and chill spot at all. So it's a marathon. It's a half marathon, we'll say, or something like that. It's that mid distance, really hard power endurance climb. And I underestimated it completely. I thought that, like, because the moves weren't so hard and that I had a ton of endurance, that it would be relatively, like, not super difficult. Hard. I expected 515, but I expected something that would just kind of click really quick. In fact, it did the complete opposite. And it wasn't until after about 5 weeks of trying it that I had my best try. And it was like the last day that we left. I like stuck the crux and fell off. And it was kind of interesting. That's when I realized, like, my anaerobic base was way smaller than I thought it was. Basically, I would gas out at like 1 minute or less than 1 minute, and I needed 2 minutes to climb the route. And I thought so before the trip, I did a ton of endurance, power endurance. I did long circuits, and each on average on the circuits, I was probably on the wall longer than 3 minutes, and the moves were significantly easier. So I wasn't for a route like that, you need your max power completely at its peak, and mine was down. I kind of did the opposite of training, where I trained power and a lot of physical work early on in my training cycle, and then I like meshed in a bunch of endurance a few weeks before the trip, and that was actually what probably killed my progress on the route. As if I were to flip it and start my training block with a ton of endurance climbing and then work in max power and physical training leading up to the trip, I probably would have climbed the Super Krakenet.
Uh,
In
dude,
terms of Adam on, what's that?
just before you go on, because I really want to like
Hmm.
highlight this or put a bookmark for maybe us to revisit later. But something you said,
Hmm.
excuse me, something you said right in the beginning was really important to me, where you struggled on a route that you thought you were going to do well on, and then what it made you do is dive into literature and understanding
I love
and
that.
deconstructing the route. And we
Hmm.
can like, because a topic that I want to look at later is kind of like this busting plateaus, what happens
Hmm.
when you hit a plateau, especially at such a high level that you're at. And actually Ethan had questions around like your structure of training. But
Yeah,
I just wanted to bookmark that because that is so freaking
yeah.
cool that you did that and really interesting. But yeah, Almondra, is it as impressive a flash as the headlines made it out? Because it sure seemed impressive.
It's it's extremely impressive. It's beyond what the headlines say, and I know there's, and to be totally honest, Super Krakenet is probably quite low end 9A plus, and one could even argue that it could be a 9A of 14 plus, but I don't think anyone's doing themselves any favor of calling that route 14D, to be honest. It's just like harder than any other 14D imaginable, basically. So theoretically that makes it 9A plus, but just barely, I would say, 9A plus. Although, like, Adam or some of these World Cup climbers are probably the perfect examples of the type of climber that could flash a route like this, because it is so incredibly sustained and technical. There's small feet, there's small hands, there's no jugs, but there's no terrible hold on the route either. So it's basically like a World Cup final route, but a bit harder. You know what I
Dude,
mean? And yeah.
my first World Cup season in I think 2019 was I had the same sentiment, the same exact, or
Hmm.
2018. I think it was the same exact thing where I trained a ton of endurance, a ton of aerobic capacity. I was even running like a ton. I'd never run before
Hmm.
for climbing. I was running a ton. I also gained 10 pounds running over three
Oh, you
months, which
built
was
your
ridiculous.
legs.
My legs built
Climbers
so
have to be
much.
very careful with running. I actually
I
don't
know.
suggest it at all.
Same, yeah, same after
Hmm.
that. Especially, I was like, a lot
Hmm.
of the kids that I would coach would be like, "Should I start running?" I'm like, "Nah, like
Yeah.
probably not." It was definitely not helpful for
Maybe for
me.
fun, or
Right,
active recovery, but
right. But finding some aerobic capacity training is definitely helpful. But I did the
yes.
exact same thing. I was doing, 100 move circuits, 1,000 moves a day, like going
Hmm.
crazy, like 2 weeks on, and then doing like straight into like more low intensity power endurance training. I was like, I'm the fittest I've ever been.
Hmm.
And I showed up to the World Cups, and the average score to like make the semifinal was like about 30 holds. And
Hmm.
like that is
Yeah.
exactly what I thought when I saw Super Crank, and I was like, oh well, I mean, Andre is the perfect climber to do that because for
Hmm.
him, V8 to V9, V10 movements don't feel that stressful. Like it's not even that. Like, of course, his physical capabilities are higher in order to send that route. Like you're saying, your anaerobic capacity was just straight up not there, and his is
Hmm.
probably there, but it doesn't mean just to me that I know. I'm sure there are people who have the base to be able to do that route and maybe still wouldn't, right? Or
Hmm.
definitely wouldn't flash it. And for him, it was like the comfort thing. Like watching him climb it, I think the significant thing was how comfortable he looked, right? How
It,
how
it's in,
confident he
it's
looked.
insane. I mean, I saw
Mm-hmm.
two people climb it when we were there actually, and one guy tried it like 1,000 times kind of. So when he did it, it looked like cruise mode,
That's
easier
awesome.
than Adam for sure. Um, but he had tried it, 100 more times than Adam, obviously. But the other, it's just the way you climb it is just so fast. You don't really see a lot of scrappy errors in it. And but people are still fighting. And with Adam, that video is just it's really impressive. I mean, it's crazy. That route, um, or he was built for that route basically, I think, and he prepared for it accurately. And I think having that base of like the way the World Cup climbers train, I think that was really helpful in that route.
Yeah.
And it's funny because like I was getting frustrated in France because I was in good shape. I would for one day I stepped away and I could do 8C plus in a couple tries. And I was like, I'm clearly in good shape, but this 8C plus was like 80 feet long, and I was built for that. I should have gone to Spain, or I should have gone to another crag and just try a longer, hard route, and I probably would have climbed really well in like Oleana. But simply put, it's too late that in a performance phase like that, you can't just switch into that building that anaerobic base. But ironically, what happened was climbing on that route kind of did train me. So by the end of the trip, I had my best tries, and I was like, wow, I'm like gonna send the route now. But then we had to go home. We already kind of like pushed it to the max. And then when I came home to New Mexico, I was like in the best shape I had been in years, and I had nothing to climb on. We went down to the tunnel, and I climbed a couple 14 minus routes, and it was always just like, wow, I can't believe I missed my peak that hardcore. And that's going to Josh's point, like that's what made me really think like I didn't just like miss the goal here. I like completely shot another target. Like I didn't even like and I wanted to learn why. And then actually funny thing about Cameron Hurst is I saw his blog on why he was climbing those routes and his that he's actually going to school for this. So let's keep in
Yeah.
mind that I'm kind of armchair expert here. I'm just like looking at books and online articles. So I'm an expert by no means. I'm no expert on this. So I'm just learning about it. But I read his article and I was like, that's really interesting. That is completely not what I did for my training, what he explains in that. And I was like, that's probably why I felt really strong cracking net 6 weeks after into trying it. I peaked when I got home. It was like, and
Yeah.
that was eye opening. But at the time, I didn't know why. I just thought I was fit from the trip. And usually when I come back from trips, I'm like tired, you know what I mean? But this time I rested for a few days, relaxed a little bit, and then I was like peaking. I was like, should I fly back to France like right now for a week and probably be perfect? But I kind of wrote it off and I was like, I'm gonna use this as like a kind of a big learning platform, and it was kind of like a tail between my legs. Like it's been a few years since I've climbed really a hard route like that. And mostly, I mean, I've talked to you guys a little bit about it or brought it up, is like because of the route, I had this epiphany of like the routes that I'm trying in the last couple of years, and the style of climbs are not only harder grade wise, but they're completely a different physiology chain or like a style than what I did in the past. You know, the last really hard route I did was Joe Mama, and it's, 110 feet long. It's a pure endurance climb, and that was like a peak. I was climbing really well at that time. So like the next projects, all of the other projects I've had since then are like half that length and much, much harder. So I wanted to learn how to better prepare for these routes, and then the Krakenet basically was right in my face, an example of what happened, and how I could train better. So that's my mission now, is just preparing better for the fall projects that I have.
That's so cool. I just love that
This is
acknowledgement
awesome.
of, there's something to be said for just climbing a bunch, building that base, like, learning how to climb, and that will get you really far, just showing up and trying
Hmm.
hard day after day after day. But we kind of talked a little bit about, maybe we can go into, or you just kind of did, about this busting of plateaus. And no matter how good you are, you always there's times where it's tough to progress. And I just love that thinking, where you look back on your career and where you've seen a lot of success and where you're struggling in, and just kind of picking at that and looking for threads that are the same or different, and then changing your training, or potentially route choice too, to
Yeah.
to emphasize what you're good at. And yeah, I find that just really interesting, that you notice that those particular climbs kind of were this middle ground, almost, where you're like, oh, like, I actually have really, really good endurance on long stuff, and and you're clearly a strong boulderer, but then there's this other kind of middle distance. And I gotta say, Ethan, in that same question about Super Cracknet, he said,
Uh-huh.
"Will Andra flash Joe Mama?" Which is interesting.
Oh, uh, well, funny story about the Joe Mama thing, in Krakenet is Maddie Hong and we were in Spain with Adam when he was preparing to flash that route. And at the time, he had already done Krakenet. But we were formulating a story for Real Rock, and they were kind of getting their pieces in line. And or maybe, did he do it? I think he did it, or he was about to. Maybe he did it just after that trip. Long story short, he didn't end up trying Joe Mama. But
That
we
was in the
helped
movie.
film.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that was
and
crazy.
yeah, we shot that. So we were
Yeah.
there in that whole process of giving him the beta and him observing us climb and stuff,
That's right.
and his thought
I remember
process
that.
behind that. And unfortunately, the weather didn't work out. It was kind of wet, conditions weren't great. It was kind of tail end season of Oleana, and it was actually Maddie, or maybe it was both of us. We kind of advised him not to try it.
It
It
sounded more like you two were the only ones in that
yeah.
whole thing, because everybody was like, "This is the opportunity, like you got to go," and it seemed
Hmm.
like you guys were like, seemed kind of smart not to go,
Hmm.
like just clear that it wasn't a good season, like it wasn't a
Yeah.
good.
Well, it was a good like Matt, like people
Mm,
climbed hard that season, and Adam probably could have. There was a chance he would still flash the route, especially on the one day that it was kind of looking good. But I think, and it's not like I'm super close to the Adam or Maddie is, but we know each other, and I think he saw me try it once or twice, and
mm.
maybe some other people climbing on the wall, and just kind of like talking about the conditions a certain way. He was like looking at people's skin, like, what does your skin look like after the try? And I mean, he's really smart. I mean, and
Dude, yeah.
and I think it was probably me and Maddie together. It was a couple of years ago now, so I don't remember exactly, but it was like we were like, dude, I mean, you could probably make a really good try right now, but is it the best condition? Is it the day where it's like you can't fall? It's so sticky and it's like frictiony. That Oleana rock is really specific. It's really sharp, and if you get this cold, dry wind, it's like completely different texture. It's like the red or something where one day to the next feels completely different. And same with Oleana. And on a peak performance attempt like flashing Joe Mama, kind of all the variables, even for someone like Adam, they need to be in the right place. So
Totally.
it just wasn't the season. But physically, could he flash? I think actually flashing a route like Joe Mama is probably an easier flash attempt than Super Krakenet, I would say.
Wow.
Just because there's more margin for there's a larger margin for error on a route like that. And if he made it through the bottom and one or two moves in the upper crux, he would do it, I think, you know. And the fighting part where a lot of people fall off, and where I fell a lot of times, where Maddie fell a few times, and countless others who done the route, you know, I don't think he would fall in that section because I
That's
think
crazy.
technically speaking, like he's able to fight just that much more, you know, and we were too. It just took us longer to fight that much more potentially on routes that hard, you know. Um,
So,
so that long story short, the conditions just didn't line up, so he didn't try the route, and he still hasn't tried the route as far as I know. So that's
it,
still there, and he hasn't tried Jumbo Love, and you know,
ooh, that'd be good.
yeah,
It does make sense. I like that you guys are probably the voice of reason in the sense that you understand how few 515s there really are. Like if that is really his goal, like
yeah.
you have to be
Hmm.
strategic because it's not like, I mean, because he's done so freaking many. Um, you just in the last hour have dropped the names of lots of very good climbers. Adam Hondra, Ethan Pringle,
Yeah.
our mutual friend,
Uh-huh.
and Daniel. And I guess I'm just kind of curious, being around all these guys. What thread have you seen? Like they're all so different. Like all those climbers are really different. Like they look different. They climb different. The
Hmm.
Daniel to Daniel and Almondra are very different kind of climbers. But we've talked about how the theme of this podcast is really how to go from good to great, and I want to hear about your journey from good to great. But maybe we can start by talking about some of these top climbers and what you see as a consistent thread, or what makes them different from everyone else. Either what makes them all the same yet all unique and different.
I think what makes them all unique and different is exactly that, that they are all unique and different. Like Adam, Daniel, and Ethan are the climbers we see today because they have pursued their own path. You know, they're not really followers at all. And if, you know, we've learned anything about excellence in sports or in business or beyond, is that individuals are really the people who succeed the most, you know, and that, or they innovators in a way. And I would say that like Daniel, for his time and age when we were young, is he was an innovator in the way that he would train himself, you know. He was doing like one arm pull-ups and, like you said, these tiny little dead hang things when he was really really young, and no one taught him to do that. No coach said to do this. He kind of, I think maybe he knew of like James Litz and a couple other people who were just super strong and finger forward, and like, and Daniel thought like, that'll be me. I'm gonna do that. You know, I'm gonna be just wicked strong in my fingers, and I'm gonna be able to pull everything down to my chest. And where Ethan, I think Ethan and I kind of followed somewhat of a similar path where we were inspired by generational type climbs, you know, like very important test pieces through time, and kind of pursued that. And yeah, I think it's a natural progression that like when you pursue high end climbs like that, you break into a higher level of climbing. And then Adam, I think, you know, he just he's an innovator. We can't deny that. Like he really is a game changer in the way that he viewed climbing training. Much like we could probably, and it will probably be said later in as time goes on, that Adam was probably very similar to Wolfgang Gulich in the sense that like what's Wolfgang famous for? Like bringing new grades into the climbing world, but also the way he achieved them was different. He didn't just climb a new grade; he trained. He brought training to the, you know, he developed like training with the campus board and different types of physical training, right? From traditional sports, he brought it into climbing, and that's how he achieved probably those hard routes that he did in Germany and beyond. Same with Adam. We see him, you know, how many times have we all viewed like those videos where he kind of exposes his training style to people and everyone's blown away? There's memes about it, people are laughing, this and that, you know, like with the miming or climbing in a sweat in a sauna, you know, to train for the Olympics. I mean, this stuff is kind of sounds silly, but you gotta admit that like that's different. The difference between him and everyone else is that he thought of it first, or maybe not first, but he applied it first and made it something. You know what I mean? So much like business or something like that, that's why he's successful and that's why he's great is because um
Okay, you lagged out for
oh
a
yeah.
sec, but we'll edit or
Oh, no
whatever.
worries.
Um,
Yeah.
dude, I was definitely one of those people. I hate to say this because I freaking love watching Almondra now, but I was
Hmm.
maybe put off at first by some of his techniques or tactics, and like that the miming stuff where he would have people like pressing on his leg and really yeah, doing it just like
You were put off by the extreme training
yeah,
kind of.
I mean, just sometimes I would see him do things like the miming thing, especially. And I loved when he had
Hmm.
his coach actually applying pressure to his knee and
Hmm.
everything, and like really, you could see that I feel like his visualization and mental obsession with that side of climbing really is unique and special, and it's something me and Tim talk a lot about is how powerful visualization is, but it's
Hmm.
one thing to talk about that. It's another to really make it an important part of your training. And that's not to say that he slacks on any other area of his training, just that's
No.
cool. That's new or new-ish, you
I
know?
And I think like more my point with the atom, his greatness is more not that like whether it works or not, is it's the fact that he's thinking of it that way. You know, where even I could tell you countless or not countless, but a number of even pro climbers that actually follow a program that someone else did. And or that they just kind of create this formula that works for them and year after year it's kind of the same and they're not changing. But I would argue to say that like guys like Adam probably change the training all the time and are constantly looking for different loopholes and leaks and weaknesses and ways to improve. I mean, just
Dude,
constantly building on what he has already.
that what you're saying right now is like why coaching for me is equally like something I'm obsessed with, but also like
Hmm.
constantly frustrated with constantly
Hmm.
because my goal isn't to be a coach. My goal is to help people pursue excellence, pursue performance at their highest level to achieve greatness in whatever they, define. And a lot of people define greatness in the same way in climbing. A lot of people see what greatness looks like and can somehow fathom almost in our conversations right now. People can fathom that type of stuff, but somehow cannot translate that to their daily lives, right? So
Hmm.
a lot of what insight that I provide is exactly what you're saying. Like ask why it's even challenging what you're doing. Ask
Hmm.
yourself what the goal is, ask yourself what's challenging, and then ask yourself the value in like specific types of training. And then at the end of it, I always get asked for a training plan. And I'm like, listen though, like
Yeah.
that's the point though, is like
Yeah.
you have to find your own training plan because you have
Hmm.
to understand your value systems based on what you find challenging, based on what you have experienced, right? And
Hmm.
everybody's going to experience something different. Now, a lot of us can come to the same conclusions about the importance of some physiology in our training, and that's where I think like people can go into the same net. So if I form
Yeah.
training plans for people, I say, all right, well, this is the net of thought that we should be training our bodies in. But when it comes to the specifics, like the actual things that you're doing, that is totally dependent on your leaks and your weaknesses and your lowest hanging fruits and what you value.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of been my change of thought, my rethinking of training this year has been don't necessarily change the training, but understand how I'm
Right.
training. You know what I mean? So I think more valuable to anyone is just to understand what's happening when you go in and do a fingerboard exercise or you do a power exercise or you do endurance on a rope. Just understand what that is. And you could interchange the exercises in an infinite possible way, like different ways, but if you understand that what you're actually doing and how that translates into
Right.
your training or your body, that's probably more important than the actual exercise.
Right. And I will
Yeah.
say, to the listeners out there, I think there's nothing wrong with following any sort of monotonous routine because that will build something, right?
Yeah.
That will build
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
absolutely, right?
That's a
But that
great
has to,
disclaimer.
right?
Yeah.
But that's like people end up making that the end all be all,
Well,
where it's like, what's my next progression?
I just want to point out though that just to combine what you guys are both saying is that if you can go out and follow a monotonous program and you will learn something, but or you will probably maybe even progress, but it's what you're doing, John, where it's more about learning something. So you followed some program
Hmm.
that didn't really accomplish what you were looking to accomplish with CrackNet. I mean, you trained, you got stronger. You just maybe got
Hmm.
stronger in a way that wasn't advantageous for your goals. And so to me, it's like that's the combining of all those factors. It's like, okay, like
Yeah.
hangboarding can get my fingers stronger. Okay, this, pull, aerobic training can do this, but bring it all together and apply, or maybe it's applying that. And then the next step is bringing that all together and say like, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What was the outcome?
Yeah.
How can I tweak this for next time?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you
I mean,
almost have to have like a backwards approach where you understand the goal deeply and understand exactly how to get to that goal, or you have to fail enough
Yeah,
times
yeah,
with
and
that
that,
goal and
uh,
then dissect it.
yeah, and I never meant to like discredit like coaching or anything. Like I think it's really an important part of climbing, and a lot of athletes and young climbers especially, they need that structure. It's very important. And in the first few years of climbing, you learn kind of the base general skills, but then a little bit of structured training is very important. And even without a huge understanding of why you're doing it, just if the coach says and follow the program, you should improve. But I think when you get to the point that the Adams and the Daniels and Ethans and myself are, it's like you really need to understand what each kind of part of training or bit of climbing you're doing is actually doing to your body. And then there's the kind of an older school style of climbing. Like, so this is interesting. Like we could talk about Dave and Chris in that generation a bit where they don't train necessarily. Chris might, do a little bit of time in the gyms because he's in the city a lot. He has a family, owns gyms. He climbs in the gym a bit, but Dave definitely doesn't. And Dave has had like small stints of a little bit of training, but very unstructured and kind of just climbing. And I think these guys are training without realizing it though, because of Dave is doing 5 days a week on 8C Boulder climbing for 4 hours at a time, that's significant training already. It just doesn't look like what it does in the gym necessarily. Or if Chris is trying, his project Sleeping Lion that he climbed, if he's trying that 2 times a week, that's significant training as well. It just the timeline for the results from that might just be a little bit longer, a bit. Um, but I actually, it's funny. I listened to an interview with Chris recently because I really like Chris's like outlook on climbing and his philosophy around it. And he said it was so awesome, and it applies a lot to what we're talking about now. Was that like, okay, you could look at two climbers climbing biography, use biography as just a general example, and you have climber A who goes there 3 years in a row, like a lot of climbers have or whatever, and just try it, and just beat it into submission and work through it and then send it eventually, after this long process. And then you have climber B who goes to Seiyus and climbs it in 2 weeks or in a few short sessions or something like that. But what led up to that ascent was probably months or if not years of training and specifically preparing for that climb. So on paper, one guy does it in this amount of time, and then the other climber does it in this amount of time. That's a bit longer, but it's probably close to even, actually, the amount of effort it took to climb the route in terms of, you just talk about back end work or front end work. So, back end work, putting time in the gym, working really hard for a specific goal, that's months. So it's kind of funny, like I went to crack a net and tried it for 5 weeks and say I sent it. So I say I sent it in 5 weeks and, 30 days and, 60 tries. However, it's hard to argue that my effort didn't start months before when I started training for the route you know. So there's two
Yeah.
ways to view success in climbs. So like when Dave sends a boulder problem, it takes him 50 days and he does a new V16, and then Daniel goes and climbs it in 15 days. But Daniel probably spent a lot of the season already training in the gym, sacrificing those days on rock to train. So their output, their amount of effort is roughly the same or similar. And so
Yeah,
I've
that's
been
Chris's
experiencing
nugget or whatever, his
yeah.
dude.
his knowledge,
I've been
his
experiencing
wise
something
perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been experiencing something in my climbing like quite similar. I mean, Josh and I've talked about this. Like, I have personally never
Hmm.
climbed anything harder than V14. I've actually only done one. Personally, I believe I've done
Oh wow.
much harder than that in the gym, and I've only
Yeah.
done like,
Yeah.
and I've climbed. I constantly climb in the gym. Josh and I are like
Hmm.
obsessed with the gym. We're obsessed
Hmm.
with the gym culture and like what the gym can provide, and also I
Yeah.
think that experience, but also we're obsessed with the outdoors. We're obsessed with going out and like trying climbs, and like actually Josh has told me multiple times that he's like never really projected anything. I'm like, yeah, there's
Hmm.
nothing like, but you can send hard, like you could send super hard, and I think that's definitely interesting. I've thought about that a lot, and a lot of people have asked me what's better. And my
Hmm.
answers always do both. My answers always do both because it's not so much of what amounts to more success. It's just your perspectives are going to change. Like
Hmm.
if you experience one side of climbing where, you do a bunch of training and you go out and send, which is my approach to climbing, where, I did a day in Moe's where I did like 10 double digits. I did 3 V13s and I flashed my first V12. And it's like, but I did all of that training for many, many, many years. And I
Hmm.
showed up one day, I happened to have a new crag with a bunch of climbs that I could do
Hmm.
first try, and people are like, that's insane. I'm like, yeah, but I do that like daily,
I'm
kind of,
prepared for
like
that.
I prepare
Yeah.
for that daily, but then also
Yeah.
now I'm kind of sick of it. I'm kind of sick of the perspective. I want to go and try something and, bang my head on it for thousands of tries, and
I mean,
something
you
impossible.
probably owe it to yourself. Like,
Right.
maybe don't train as hard one season, but train a little bit and then go to a place with the intention of just laying down camp and working really
Exactly.
hard. It in the end, the amount of time, the timeline might be similar,
Well, yeah.
to the success, but potentially projecting like what Chris and Dave and a lot of people do and myself, could yield higher results a bit,
Yeah.
if
To
you've
me,
never done it before, especially.
what I hear from that is that the number one thing that is required is always effort, right? Like,
Mm,
high
yeah.
output of effort where it's like, okay, maybe Chris
Hmm.
just lives at the crag, or Dave puts in, 50 days and he's out there trying hard. But uh, I think what it means is that it's hard to put out effort on something when you don't like it. So, if you're not psyched
Yeah.
on the gym, like maybe, Dave just, I don't know, I don't see him as like being a gym rat, and just, he's probably not having a blast there. Like where he finds his ability to really put it out is on the
Hmm.
rock. And then for me, I do enjoy the gym. But I also, I was living in San Francisco. There wasn't much rock around me, and you got a
Right. And
job and you just
yeah.
do what you do,
And
but
you have
the key
you
is,
have amazing gyms. Yeah.
yeah, God, those gyms were amazing. But to me, I like what I hear from that is, um, showing up, doing what you love, and putting it all out there really does lead to success. Although then it does seem like, in some ways, as you start getting at that really high end, though, that there's probably some tactics that you employ, or because even with Chris and
Definitely.
Dave,
Yeah.
I have a hunch that I don't I'm not saying like they're out there on the hangboard with some secret program that's giving them all their results, but to think that over their multi-decade career that they don't have little things that they do that kind of helps them show up better in those moments prepared seems naive to me, even if it may not look like, quote unquote, they're not like, oh look, I have these no hang blocks that I do with my back three and it really makes a difference. It's not that, right? It's like
Right.
it's something
No.
unique to
But
them.
I think, when we view climbers like Dave and Chris and a handful of others, I mean, their generation of climbers started in a completely different era of, not totally different than us, because maybe me and you, Josh, were kind of similar, closer to them in age, but the climbing gyms when they first started climbing were not what they are today. The training culture, even with the Golics and stuff like that, still isn't what it is today. And so they've learned how to progress in climbing in a very unique way, through rock climbing, basically. And their skills on the rock are obviously incredible. And then now we have the generation where people's skill on rock probably isn't quite as good, but they're just so much stronger. I mean, they're 10 times stronger than not than those guys, but then maybe than those guys at that same age. You know what I mean? Like they're so
No,
strong, it's
it, it
incredible.
it really makes me think of two things. I've got a few years on you, and I think I started a few years earlier, and so I was like back in like
Hmm.
94 or something is when I started. I want to say
Oh wow.
94.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I bet.
and
More
something
like
that
Dave's generation. Yeah.
yeah, although right when I started kind of getting better, it's really like Chris was like the man. It was just like very
Hmm.
clear very early on that he
The
was Chris
man, the man
Sharma.
boy.
Yeah, yeah, doing
He's like a kid,
everything. Yeah.
probably. Yeah.
Um, but the reason why I bring it up is because I would say that back then training was taboo. Training would be embarrassing. It would be like the two things
Hmm.
I remember would be like, don't train, or that would be, yeah, that would be like what you need to train. And it's really stood out in my head as like, that was not an appropriate thing to do back then, or it was looked down upon for whatever reason. And I don't
Hmm.
want to get into it, but what also made me think of this ability on the rock. So I actually did know Ethan way, way back then, but I kind of reconnected with him later on in life. And I remember
Hmm.
watching him on site, this 13C as like a warm up when we were in China. And what really stood out in my head was the way he read the rock. Uh, it just showed me like the depth of knowledge he had of climbing on rock and understanding rock. And I just remember because it was like I sent it, but it was a very hard climb for me at
Hmm.
the time. And the crux was cryptic, and it was like you had to reach way back. It was completely blind. I had no idea
Hmm.
how someone could figure it out, and Ethan climbed it perfectly. And it it's this thing where it's like there's getting strong, there's climbing well, there's reading a route, there's under, and just I do think that in today's generation with climbing gyms and the training that we have available, we are creating people who are stronger but less technically proficient at rock climbing. And I have a hunch, though, that maybe we're starting to see this break out into another level. I do think that maybe like the Sean Rabbit, the kind of a little bit even younger, more like in your age range,
Hmm.
Tim, where there's this
Yeah,
combining
like
of
Hayden
like
Roberts and
like the best
Yeah.
training and the best technical ability on rock. And it's cool to see climbing just continue to evolve.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
agree with
think
that.
we're seeing like a big shift now where a lot of the skill-based climbers are being combined with a strong training background. So like Adam Ondra is probably the first big example of that, that he has more years of climbing than so many people his age, right? He's been climbing his almost his whole life. Then he added the training to it, you know. Like at an early age, and now all the younger climbers in Adam are coming up. They're so good because they're combining the two even more. And I'd say like in the earlier, like the Daniels and we were like climb a lot and get strong, but now it's like get strong first, then go climb a lot, basically. And yeah, it's just a couple more years. We'll see how, I don't know how many, B16 boulders, they're popping up everywhere, basically.
You guys, we should kind of start wrapping up. I have like a million questions, and like I don't know how to like
I
get
could
through
talk a
the.
lot about this stuff. I find it like
It,
so
Oh yeah,
interesting.
me
oh, you
too.
too?
Yeah.
Really? You like this stuff too, John?
Well,
um,
like actually breaking it down because I don't actually do it very often, and every now and then it's funny. Like with the Ethan or some other friends, we actually do occasionally talk about stuff like that because it's just cool to get
oh wait,
others'
let's
Yeah.
perspective.
hear you and Ethan dirtbagging as kids and how fun it is. I
Oh,
think maybe that's a good transition to like
yeah.
being a pro,
Uh-huh.
like coming up
Hmm.
and climbing, doing dirtbag stuff, but then being a pro. And yeah, what was that formative trip like with Ethan? When was that? How old were you guys?
So that was 2007, I believe, because I had just graduated high school the year before, or like right around there. And then so Ethan, how old is he? Ethan must be 2 or 3 years older than me.
He's about
3 years
30,
maybe.
37, 36, 37.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I'm 34. So we were young, and it was, I had like a Razor flip phone, and it didn't work in Europe, of course. Like no contact, and no email. Like you go to internet cafes for like the email, once a month to the parents or whatever, or something like that. And we went there. I actually went earlier with a friend of mine, Gabor CK, and I don't know if you guys have heard of Gabor.
Oh yeah.
He's a climber from the Northeast growing up. He's a good friend of mine as well. He lives in Boulder now. He went into economics or something big, finance. But anyways, I was there with him and his family, and we were climbing in Nice and Gorge Loop, and I had known Ethan obviously from before, and he wanted to join our trip, so he flew down into Nice, and then we all went to Sayus for the summer, and then Gabor and his sister, they ended up, leaving the trip, and then it was just Ethan and I, and then Matt Siegel joined us actually, and us three climbed like
Wild.
the whole summer. We stayed in one, like we were camping at first, and then some in Sayus, the campground. There's like these kind of like really old, kind of like broken down like trailer homes, and the people staying in there, a little family, like moved out, and we jumped on the opportunity, so we all like took over one of this like trailer home thing, and
Wow.
it yeah, so it was kind of funny, like, so we were all kind of in there, and we didn't really have a lot of money, even Ethan, and so we were kind of living off of like the cheap groceries that are there in the campground. So we're talking like a can of tuna, maybe some veggies, maybe, and then like a baguette, like every day, or tabbouleh, like couscous and stuff. And we'd go into town, but the only way to get into town was to hitchhike. So down into Gap, which is about 45 minutes or half an hour drive down. Sometimes we'd stop in Sogoye on the way and get like little snacks, but it depended. Like, so sometimes the driver could only take us to Sogoye, so we'd stop in Segoya, wait out for a while, and like literally like with the thumb out, hitchhike and then get into Gap. And then when we were in Gap, we'd splurge. We'd go get like some fruit. We'd get avocados were huge. We ate like hundreds of avocados that summer probably. Because it was like high calorie. It lasted a long time. You didn't feel as hungry. And we would eat, we'd cook like simple pastas and rice and like that and get our groceries for the day. And then once it was around like 3 or 4, it was kind of, work was letting out. So a lot of people were driving out of the town. So we'd walk to this one road and just hitchhike and kind of wait until we could get rides back up to Sayus. Um, so we
Wow.
did that all summer. And we had some friends, like once Ethan kind of hurt his finger really badly, like the skin, like tore his flapper off. And it was already like 2 months in Sayus, so we were both kind of burned out at the time. He was trying biography, getting really close. And then one day he decided to try some EB or whatever on another wall, and he broke a hold and like ripped his pad off the finger, and he was like, I'm over this, let's leave Sayus. So we decided to, and I was kind of over it too, 2 months of hiking up the hill, it's just like a lot of work. And so we were like, yeah, let's go, we have some time. So we like hitchhiked and got a ride from some friends that we knew in the campground to Innsbruck, and we stayed in Innsbruck for a couple weeks and climbed in the gym because I knew Jakob Schubert and a couple other friends at the time. So we stayed between their place and some others and just kind of hung out in Innsbruck and trained in the gym just so like the skin could heal. We climbed in the Zillertal a little bit and bouldered around. And then we were like, well, it's time to go back to Sayus. And Ethan, I was like, yeah, you could definitely go do that route. So let's head back. And so we went back. We got a ride. I don't even Ethan remembers it better to me than me. It's kind of crazy. But I think we still got rides with friends, or maybe we took a train this time on the way back. We went back to France, and shortly after, Ethan climbed the route, and trip was done. And then it was funny because it was a thing like between Matt and Ethan and I, it's like the bet was like when he would send the route, we would shave our heads. So like he did the route and we all had to shave our heads. It's kind of crazy.
Oh my God,
It was like the
amazing.
ending. It was like this big release, like he had this crazy mop of hair and I did too. And so did Matt, and we just all like shaved each other's heads, and that's the most that I remember from those trips. But it was all like
Yeah.
completely different than the way we travel now and the way we view trips now. But it was super formative for me. It like, and I met Dave that trip and climbed with Dave a bit. That's when he did biography as well. And um, that was like instrumental too, like seeing Dave and Ethan like travel the world and go climbing, and I was kind of doing the same. But I was kind of like hanging on a bit, not in their shadow necessarily, but they're definitely like the ones, the big pro climbers kind of doing the thing. And it kind of set that trend, for a long time. That's kind of what I was kind of in a way tagging along with my friends, but my friends just happened to be like super high profile rock climbers. So That's how I got a lot of opportunity, but that's also maybe where a lot of what I did was shadowed a little bit,
I
based
remember
on
I
just those that I was around.
I kind of remember seeing either a video or hearing them talk about you being the most underrated climber, like that you were, yeah, like that you were uh, extremely strong and maybe a little under the radar, which is just funny to hear it from that perspective. But dude, how fun does
Yeah.
that sound, man? Like, how Tim, do you want to do that? I just want to do that. I'm like old with
Yeah.
kids. I'm
Well,
just
It
like,
was
I just want to
really
go.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's crazy because like I mean I definitely experienced something similar. I definitely wasn't like man, like my upcoming was if I get strong enough and if I get to a place in social standpoint or whatever it is, I can get that opportunity. I can get that
Hmm.
opportunity to go and do those things. But of course I was doing it. I would go camping and like go on long road trips. I lived in Rifle in a tent for like 2 or 3 months in a row like
Yeah.
one time, and I was
That's
like, all right, that's it.
that's good enough. Yeah.
That's it. But
Yeah.
it's crazy because you don't almost
Yeah.
like almost I was like, I don't have to do this at all. Like I could
Hmm.
find a way to like get somebody to like get stoked, get somebody to like, rack up enough money to make it like a bougier trip, get, some
Hmm.
company to like support a video or like something. It feels like the industry is like completely different in that
Yeah.
you guys had to do that to climb like hard routes almost, like that was like
Especially, yeah, back then that was kind of
right, exactly.
pretty normal.
So
It
glamorous.
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
living on
Yeah.
avocado. Actually, avocado actually does sound like, but living on hardly anything like a can of tuna, and it's just funny because
Uh-huh.
maybe we can use this to transition to a topic that we wanted to touch on, and it's just
Hmm.
kind of like the behind the scenes of being a pro climber. Then, as you get older, and what that means, how do you transition into the next phase of your career, and how are we doing that with the existing climbers? And it was a different era. Although I will point out, Tim, that yeah, doing it in France probably sounds somehow more, or doing it in Europe sounds somehow more
Oh
glamorous.
yeah.
But you're still
Fair.
just, I mean,
Yeah.
anyone can go. It's just, I guess
Yeah.
the thing I want to point out, because we pointed this out with, God, I can't remember. Maybe it was with Carlo. Um, like a lot of people want to climb hard, or say to themselves or say to their friends, and they're like, yeah, if I was a pro and I could just spend all day
Hmm.
at the crag, I would send that too. And it's like, well, then just go fucking do it. Like, don't
Yeah.
you guys weren't like, no one gave you permission and said like, hey, like, you
You can't do
graduate high
it.
school and you're like, I scraped together
Hmm.
a couple $100 and I'm good to go, and I just love
Yeah.
that story. I love the passion there.
Yeah, I mean, there is something to say that like pro climbers or any pro athlete for that matter, basically the majority of the finance that goes into these athletes is exactly for that reason, to give them the time and the availability to go perform, right? But those finances aren't necessarily created or budgeted out to like give these people like long lasting careers with 401ks and retirements, and it's just not the deal. And I think that's the big misconception with becoming a pro climber, is that like, yes, it is a career. I'll say that. Like it sets a lot of individuals down the path of like being involved in the outdoor industry, and a lot of opportunities come up from being a high profile person, just period. I mean, your network and the amount of people and the visibility you get will lead to a lot of opportunity in the future. But the way these companies view it, or part of the way, is that they're supporting a product or a person to do a task. Most climbers are under, you know, um, independent contractors, and independent contractors are exactly what it sounds like. It's a contracted gig, not a salaried career necessarily. And in the company's minds, it's kind of like, just like you would when you're remodeling a house or something, you bring in subcontractors and contractors to do the work. But when the work's done, I mean, you don't need the contractors until you have the next line of work and coming in. Um, I will say though, in terms of longevity for a pro climber, it is in a company's best interest, most likely, to have a longer relationship with these independent contractors or their athlete team. It just looks better. They're able to develop on more product and have, or projects, not product, sometimes product, but on video projects, or they just see people grow. Like we've seen Chris grow through Piranha, right? As a young kid and now as an adult, and potentially even invested in the company a bit. But those are the bigger examples of high profile athletes, but I think, it should never really be the expectation that you'll become a pro climber and that this is like through the companies, that's going to be your lifelong career because it's really just they're giving you the opportunity to do your best as a professional figure in the sport, but not necessarily like um, a long-lasting career with them, But it goes both ways a bit, If
That's
that makes
some
any
really
sense.
good
I don't know. I
advice
kind of
to
went off
it.
a little. Yeah.
No, no, it's great because I think that's actually one of my questions for you was going to be what is advice to kind of young climbers or people looking to go into this industry? And I think you said something really interesting there where they give you an I'm going to paraphrase, but it's like you get an opportunity to start your professional career in a way. It wasn't just like that you
Hmm.
sign up and it's like, hey, you're going to be on the dole for the rest of your life. Good luck, or or have fun. Just go live it up. It's like this
Yeah.
is almost like a stepping stone to now you making almost like your own brand. And it's something me and Tim talk about. It's if you look at some of the most successful athletes, or even if you look at the roster of athletes in I don't know Black Diamond is one of our favorite companies, and it's who uh, Tim is sponsored by right now. And
Hmm.
it's not that it's just the hardest climbers in the world, and the people who've been on there and been part of the team for a long time, they add something as a professional to the climbing community that is not just sending hard. And so I just think there's something
Hmm.
there that I love where it wasn't like, this is the only path. Like you just need to send hard and you'll make money for the rest of your life. It's like, no,
Yeah.
this is the start.
Well, some of the best advice I got when I was younger. So I'll start with that, because I have my own advice for young climbers wanting to become professionals and pursue that. Um, but Dave Graham, because he helped me a lot over the years of becoming a professional climber and getting me involved with certain companies, and his big thing was like, and maybe this is an East Coaster or Northeaster kind of thing, but he's like, people, they're just too self-entitled. They and this is like 15 years ago, right? So I don't want to just say, oh, Dave said this, Dave said that, but he was like, don't be so self-entitled. Like just because you climb so hard doesn't mean much as a professional climber. It really is like who you are in the community and how you interact with it. That's why we have influencers. That's why we have marketing campaigns. That's why we have top tier performance athletes, people who go to World Cups or people who are doing just high end, individual pursuits. But Dave really taught me that like being a pro climber, a professional climber, especially we're talking the early 2000s, so it was a little different. This is pre social media and all that. So like the biggest impact you could have was one of a couple ways, or all through, or all of them, was a doing kind of cutting edge climbing that would get into a magazine at the time because there was no like, you know, there wasn't as much online presence, so the magazine counted a lot, and getting an article in the magazine was very big. But also becoming a presence in communities, like if you go to Sayus, people know Dave Graham, period. If you go anywhere in Ticino, people know Dave Graham. If you go to Colorado, that's probably the most reach Dave has actually, because he's developed 90% of the modern bouldering in Colorado, or put it on the map. Those kind of things, it doesn't even matter that he climbs V16 or whatever. Like it really is just the fact that he spread himself so wide in the climbing community, and that made him a presence. And that's why people like Dave or Chris will always have a place as professional climbers, no matter where their performance goes. They're really community leaders, and like before them there was like Lynn Hill and those kind of people the same way, It doesn't matter that Lynn had, she had a few peaks, but she probably really peaked with the nose, but after that not much. But Lynn is still a very relevant name now, even if the nose stuff was over 20 years ago. It doesn't, she maintained that level of being a professional in our industry, and so does Dave, and so does Chris. And even though Dave and Chris still climb very hard, what matters more now is probably who they are at the crag, um, who they've been at the crag for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So to Dave's point, he was like, don't just expect to be that strong person that shows up at the crag, climbs a hard route, lowers off, cleans the draws, and gets back in their car and leaves. Like maybe stay a bit, talk to some of the people, belay someone or go have beer. You don't have to go drink or whatever, but like go interact with the community afterwards in some way in a handful of times. Um, that's 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 the point of being a person of influence and having a presence in a community is just it's not only about the top peak performance that you're going to have. Of course,
Well,
there is a small expectation to have that as a professional athlete, but it doesn't have to, it's not all of it.
Well, John, I want you to know that you definitely embody that or lived it every time your name comes up. Because I always reach out to lots of people before we do an interview, and it's just always
Hmm.
like, oh, John's a great guy. Oh, John's awesome.
Yeah.
You definitely are out there,
That's good.
living that. But I do think it's really important,
Yeah.
and climbing is a little different than basketball, where you're not going to go down to your local place and shoot hoops and bump into Michael Jordan, but you might tie
Hmm.
in next to a pro. And I do remember seeing Chris in Margalef and have it, we all had dinner at, I can't remember, whatever, like the little hotel place that everyone goes to, and just the
Oh
way
yeah, like the one by the river. Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
just the way he
Hmm.
handled himself, where so many people came up to him, like not just climbers, but the owner of that place, and he was just so gracious, such a warm person to be around, and left everyone like, oh yeah, Chris is a good guy, and you just want to be that
Yeah.
person. You don't want to be known as anything but that. But
Yeah, and I think, maybe at times it probably gets a little hard for people like Chris or Alex Honnold or Emily here, these really high profile, because sometimes you just want to go to the bar and just hang out with your friends in your group, but they take it in stride. I think they're really very community focused people, and they're just climbers too, and like all and advice to young climbers who just keep being who you are as a climber, like
Mhm.
make sure that's still your priority. And you could do the gigs with the sponsors, you could do the videos and the marketing campaigns and the silly this, silly that sometimes, but like that's the responsibility for sure. But try to keep your vision the way it was as genuine as it can be, because that'll create a longer lasting um, relationship with climbing for yourself, but also for the companies. If they see that you get responses like, yeah, so and so is a good person. I saw them at the crag. They stayed a bit longer. They supported their friend. They climbed really hard. It was super awesome. That whole package is what counts really. And that's
Yeah.
the companies and stuff. They'll continue to contract you out if you are a person like that, I think.
Well,
Dude, I'll
Tim,
take that
yeah,
advice
Tim,
all day.
you're a young pro.
Yeah,
Stop being such a jerk.
Yeah.
yeah.
No, no, yeah.
No, I was gonna say
Anything
there's
to say?
lots of thoughts. Lots of
Yeah.
thoughts. You guys have, yeah, you guys hit on a
Yeah.
lot of great points. I'm not gonna go into my opinions about all that stuff, but I do think
Yeah.
that stuff is awesome. I think it's really relevant. One experience that I have had, I mean, yeah, there's so much to break down here, but we don't have the time for it. And yeah, I'm definitely like in that web of time that you guys are talking about. Like I would say more like I'm 24 now, so like I would say in the last couple of years it's definitely been a little bit different. But pre-COVID
Hmm.
was very much like grinding for the spotlight, grinding for something, getting a
Hmm.
deal, getting something going. Like I have dreams and aspirations, like projects, places I want to be, and I need support. Like I need something to get there, or I'm gonna dirtbag it. But it seems to me that there is a way to get in, and like let's figure that out. But at the same time, I love rock climbing. At the same time, I love people. At the same time, I love meeting new people and like sharing the things that I've experienced and hearing the things that people, other people experience. And that's a huge reason why this podcast is so important to me. But at the same time, like I remember my experience, like, and I've talked to Josh about this a lot, but recently working with Black Diamond has been an extremely eye-opening experience for me. And it's not like something that supports me to the point where I don't have to do another job or anything
Hmm.
ever, by no means. And we shouldn't go into that, but I don't value getting another sponsorship like that, because
Hmm.
I think I value the relationship I have with Black Diamond. And that's something that you kind of mentioned, where it's like that's the point, isn't to get support, to give support, to do anything. It's to have that lasting relationship, because ultimately
Hmm.
that's the one that you can create anything out of. Like I'm stoked to do anything with Black Diamond today just because of my relationship with them, not so much
Yeah.
of the amount of support that I would get, or even just the company itself that I like. Like gear companies are all great, but for me it's the relationship, and like that was a
Hmm.
huge eye-opening experience for me that I could only get once I had these connections and had these experiences and all these little trips that I value. And I'm like, well, so what's important to me nowadays? And it's like I almost take steps backwards, like where I'm
Hmm.
like, well, what was important to me before all of this stuff, and then
Hmm.
and that's
Yeah.
why now I have a completely different focus in my rock climbing. And I think for the next 10 years of my life, I think every year is going to be different, and all because of these types of things.
Well,
Yeah, I
oh,
mean, having yeah, just having like a good relationship with a company like that is important because you could be honest with them, because
Yeah, yeah.
it's not that people are lying or not being honest. Maybe in some cases, sure, but like, I like, sometimes there's a lot of pressure to deliver for
Oh
these
yeah, yeah.
companies, but the more comfortable you become with them, the more you could be honest. Like, hey, you know what? Actually, this season I just haven't I had a finger tweak. I'm just not feeling like the best, but like, it's easier to be honest when you create a longing, like a longer lasting relationship, but that takes time, and a little bit of sacrifice,
Yeah.
to be that involved with a company.
I love what you said about being your authentic climber self, because we're not looking for
Mhm.
no one. I mean, that's kind of goes back to what you said. What made those different professionals you're around great is that they were themselves. They
Mhm.
were unique. They were interesting. They
Mhm.
pushed the boundaries, and I think that comes through in lots of ways, not just always hard said. So, uh, on this pro topic, John, did you by any chance prepare a pro tip? Did we ask you to do a pro tip, or did we not?
Um, I think, yeah, or like we were talking about the good to great kind of
Sure. Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
pro tip, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Those are
Well,
similar.
I have a lot, I mean,
Well,
I have
hit
some
us.
ideas of pro tips I could do, but
Yeah, I would love
yeah.
to. If you have a pro tip, something that you just learned through your decades, that's just a little gem that you can pass along that is useful
Well,
for someone like me.
yeah, so for instance, probably I'll just work with the most recent thing. Basically, in the last year, I kind of had this reflection of progress, and then the Krakenet thing happened, and so it kind of shifted me to like rethink how I was training and what I was doing, and why I didn't succeed. And I would say that that was a big shift for me. So kind of like the pro tip or the idea that I had that was really critical was like, don't be afraid to rethink something. Like just because it didn't work doesn't mean you need to just go back in the gym and hit the gym again, work harder next time. Maybe think differently of how you're going to work next time. And, um, like just the fact that I came back and bought some books and looked at physiology and scoured the internet of like something more happened here. Like mentally, I was ready. I thought I was physically ready, but I wasn't. I need to find out why, you know what I mean? And I've climbed long enough that I know I was in good shape. It's not like I was in bad shape. I was in the wrong shape. Or like for that short period of time, I wasn't in the shape I needed to have. So constantly rethink what you're doing season by season. Some things will stay the same, like certain basic training metrics, like a hangboard routine that really gets you out of a slump. Always do that, because it's going to be constant and it works for you. But then challenge yourself a bit each season of like, it didn't quite work out for me this season, so let's change things just a little bit.
Uh,
Always constantly challenge yourself.
so
Yeah.
good,
I
Tim.
love that.
Doesn't that kind of sound like I feel like that's something we harp on, where it's like, oh, you didn't succeed on this route or boulder. The answer is probably not that. You just needed to go and do two more sets of pull-ups. That's
Right.
it's thinking differently. And I like that continual growth mindset versus like
Mhm.
feeling like, oh, I just need to do more of what I'm doing. It's like, how can I grow? How can I tackle this problem in a different way? So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
good pro tip
Yeah,
there.
we got through so many of these questions, but there's so many more that I wanted to ask and stuff we want to talk about maybe we'll have to pick your brain somehow. But I very much appreciated all of the experiences that you shared, all the stories, all the insights. It was very live, like more so than some of the other guests that we've had, and I really appreciated that. So thank you for sharing.
Wait, Tim, I
Of
got one
course,
more.
yeah.
I want. I got one more.
You got one more. Go for it.
Just
Yeah.
because this was actually again from Ethan. Thank you, Ethan, for he just spit out an email of like a million things.
Well, Ethan knows me really well, so he's
Okay,
probably
I'll have
asking
to
all
ask
the
you.
questions.
I'm sure we'll get
Yeah.
Ethan on again, and we'll have to ask you for some questions about him. But this
Oh
one,
yeah, yeah.
and I actually want to kick this to you too, Tim. You've traveled a lot, John. This is kind of like open ended, but it's like, you know, what's your kind of favorite crag out there? And also, is there any kind of crag or route or boulder that you're like, I have to do this before I die? I know those are two separate things, but I want to hear about your favorite crag because I just want to put it on my bucket list. But then it also is interesting,
Mhm.
like hearing about what is the one place or route or boulder that you are just still coveting, because I think it speaks to your aesthetics and style and what you really are still excited about. So a little two-parter there.
Okay. Well, to begin, and this may be obvious, maybe not, but my favorite crag in the world is probably Sayus, in France, South France. It's just in terms of the quality of rock, the general environment, the food, the culture, it's just it. I can't really think of many more places. Follow up to that is maybe Sirana in Spain. It just has so much um, so many climbs and so much to do in Sirana. It's a very large area and it's in close circumference to a lot of cool places like, you could go to Tarragona to the beach, or you could go to Barcelona, or you could go climbing in Margalef. Um, Bouldering, this is a tough question. I'm like answering a bunch, but I can't leave out, I mean, Waco Tanks, I grew up, it's kind of in my back. I think it's one of the cooler, more unique bouldering areas in the world. But I haven't been to many, I've been to France a dozen times, but I haven't been to Fontainebleau, for instance. I go sport climbing generally. But I would say another big one, and Tim might agree with this, is I think Bishop is one of the better bouldering or climbing destinations in the world just because it's so unique. It seems unlike most things out there, to be honest. It's very special. Um,
Yeah, that's
We
awesome.
did a whole
and
Well, you've
freaking
traveled.
episode
yeah,
on Bishop.
it's in, you drive up to Bishop and it's like you got the Sierra and you got Pine Creek down the road. I mean,
Right.
it's beautiful.
It is.
It's the
It's
same way
epic
that
there.
Yosemite is to big wall
Yeah.
climbers, maybe.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, you've definitely traveled like a bunch, and you spent a lot of time like in sport crags. So I definitely
mhm.
trust your opinion on the best sport crags. And something you said that was really interesting about when is La Rambla and Joe Mama, is that in Sirana or Oleana?
La Rambla is in Tirana,
Okay.
and Joe Mama's in Oleana. And Oleana is a great
Okay.
crag too, yeah, but it's just a different thing, kind of.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned
Mhm.
something about Andre's experience about like the conditions and having that being a major factor, and that kind of leads to your experience with your skin and the rock. And I think
Mhm.
those big challenges for me is what really formed my opinion on something like Bishop, where I like Bishop not just because of sorry, Bishop is my favorite climbing destination
Mhm.
that I've been to, period. Not because just of the epic factor and how beautiful and stunning it is, and the access and everything, but how hard it is, what it's taught me as a
Yeah.
rock climber and
Mhm.
what I have to do in order to succeed on it. It's never easy for me ever,
Mhm.
but I find constant creative ways to get better and better at that type of climbing, and to me that's my favorite climbing area. And I think that will maybe change over time, but it sounds like a lot of sport climbing crags I have to go and check out for that type of practice. But also I think so there's two different answers that I have. Bishop is for me my favorite area, but my most fun climbing so far has been in the south. My most fun
Oh,
climbing
yeah.
that I have
Mhm.
regularly, boulder to boulder, area to area, place to place, just I don't know, the vibe itself is in Chattanooga, HP40,
Mhm.
like both times I had the most fun climbing. So my guess is also that maybe Fontainebleau or the Rocklands area, I think would be for me like the most fun climbing
Dude,
also,
Probably.
just
wait
in
and
that
Yeah.
style.
wait until you see uh Oleana and like Los Humildes Picasa, and you're just like, oh,
Oh
or
yeah,
yeah,
it's
that's those are cool.
those are
So what?
world
Yeah,
class routes. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah. So is there any route? Yeah, any route or boulder that you're like, I have to go here and do it before I die? Like, what's on your bucket list there, John?
Probably, oh man, there's a handful of routes. There's only a few boulders. It's funny, Jade was one of the boulders. I tried it on and off over the years. I kind of dabbled in it. I just wanted to do it because Daniel did it, and it was kind of like of our generation, like the test piece. I don't know if anyone will be able to climb it again, actually, in its current state,
Yeah, I don't
with the
think so.
closures and stuff. But we'll start with the roots. I mean, number one on my list of someday I definitely want to do it is Jumbo Love. Mostly because of the aesthetic of the line and its like historical significance. And then going back quite a few years, I really want to go try and climb Action Direct someday. I think with just kind of my background and a lot of the routes that I pursued over the years, it would feel incomplete if I didn't climb that route. Um, and just my general ability, I think in the next handful of years, I'll go check that one out as well.
That's cool.
Well,
It's
dude,
not
let me know if you
yeah.
need a Jumbo Love partner. I'm moving to Vegas and I'm
Oh
gonna be doing
yeah.
it. So
Oh yeah, for
welcome
sure.
to hit me up. I'll come out with you.
Yeah, Tim, you've been talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah, I
Jumbo
know.
Love
Now
quite a
that
bit. Yeah.
yeah. Oh
Yeah,
man,
Jumbo Love
Jumbo.
is definitely probably my North Star route right now.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's incredible. I actually tried it one day. And unfortunately I got injured on it. I
Oh
like
wow.
strained like a flexor tendon in my forearm
Yeah,
on
not
the upper
surprising.
crux and yeah. It wasn't that bad. I recovered pretty quick, but that kind of ended the trip obviously. So I haven't been back since and I've gathered too many projects in between that trip and now, so I need to clean up some stuff first. But yeah, and boulder problems, I mean, the way I view bouldering now is like I love it. I love a day out going bouldering and stuff, but I don't think I will necessarily pursue extremely high-end bouldering, um, like climbs like V15 and harder. It takes like a lot of dedication and specific training to get to that level again, and I think I just am at a point in my climbing where I find more joy and challenge and motivation and just longer sport climbs or sport climbs around the world. So bouldering might be more of like kind of a playful. I could see myself like pursuing bouldering trips rather, and maybe not one specific climb. Like it would be great to go to Bishop again and boulder a bit, or go to the Tahoe area and go bouldering a bit, or Rockland someday. I've never been, or Fontainebleau. But if I went to Fontainebleau, I probably wouldn't pursue the hardest boulders in the forest. I'd probably go try all the classics up to 8B or something like that, as many as I could, and that's how I view bouldering a bit now.
All right, you got my hands sweating good. I can't believe you've never been to
Yeah, me too.
Rocklands or Font.
I know, me too, honestly. I mean, they're on my list. Don't get it wrong.
Yeah.
They've just been lower on the list.
Darn, you guys, I really do
Yeah.
gotta wrap up because I gotta catch that flight. But you also,
Okay.
John, you totally reminded me of. I was so psyched to talk about the game. Not exactly like your process of
Oh,
doing it, but you said you
yeah.
saw Carlo do the second ascent, and you got the
Hmm.
third. And I guess we'll save that for next time, or if we can, I don't know. We'll figure out some way to get that story out of you because
Yeah.
that seemed like to really
It was a cool little thing. Yeah.
yeah. And I don't know. I guess just to wrap it. Actually, I was going to say because you might have done this route. My bucket list, my like route I always wanted to do is Tom at Jarry in Verdun Gorge. Have you gone
Oh,
and done that? Oh man, I really want to do
I
that.
I haven't. I've gone to do it twice and it's been completely wet.
Yeah.
So I got kind of shut down. Yeah, you drive up to the point and you see it and it's like soaked.
I really
So
want to do
each
that thing.
we're like, oh, we can't do it. But I have climbed in the Verdun and it's absolutely breathtaking. It's amazing. I did a couple long routes there. You could climb 1,500-foot routes there in a quick afternoon. It's pretty
Wow.
amazing. Yeah, or a
Uh,
let's say a long afternoon. But you just
cracks
get
me
that
up
exposure. Yeah.
is like we were saying how I made some comment about how like dirtbagging in Europe just sounds more glamorous, but still dirtbagging. But actually, it is more glamorous.
Mhm.
Being in Sayus and dirtbagging is way better than pitching a tent in rifle. Sorry, Tim.
Oh, no doubt
Uh,
it is.
My standards are low. I can go have
yeah.
fun.
I've spent one summer in particular up in the meadows in rifle and probably like 6 weeks, like in the cow patty shit or whatever they call it. I
Yeah.
don't know, the cow patty meadows, and like waking up with Ethan was there for a period of
Nice.
time, a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome vibe.
All right.
A little
Well,
dirtbagging.
All right.
John, I want to give you a chance to plug your sponsors, to say thank you, to share your Instagram handle with people, because that is part of being a pro, is
Yeah.
letting people know where to find you
Definitely
and
part
keep
of
up
it.
with you. And just thanks for coming on. But yeah, where can people find more about you if they want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying harder at the social thing. I do post a lot of random stuff sometimes, but I'm just Jon, Jon_ at Cardwell, and that's on Instagram and Facebook, Twitter. I don't really do much of that anymore. And I don't have a website or anything like that, so it's mostly Instagram
So
or
you
in
guys just
person at the
you have
Crag.
to,
I,
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
no, that's you guys have to just come
show up
on
at the
here
Crag.
and hear all
Yeah.
about hear from John on this podcast. But
hmm
yeah, I don't blame you. It's tough to keep up all that social media, but I really like that you show up at the Crag, and you made that you continue to make that impact on the community. I think that's underrated, and like I said, your your reputation preceded you. You really are accomplishing that, where people are appreciative of what you've done, and have lots of great things to say about you. And I just look forward to um, seeing you bust through this plateau. Hopefully I can tag along and be a belay slave. Maybe
Yeah.
I'll get a blue point of one of you guys on Jumbo
Yeah,
Dove.
if you ever guys come through or you're going to Waco or something, we're really close, So yeah,
I
you
love
guys are
Waco
Awesome.
welcome
too.
Yeah,
anytime.
I said it. I said it in my fake closer, but I very much enjoyed that. Time went so fast for me. I felt like I was just listening to your brain go through a lot of the climbing and a lot of the experiences that you had. And thank you for sharing. That was awesome.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks, John.
Cool.
I'll have to
Awesome.
do it again sometime. And thanks to everyone for listening.
All right. See you guys next week.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to learn more about Testpiece climbing, you can check us out at testpiececlimbing.com and even book a session with one of our coaches.